Greetings all, and welcome to part 2 of my Eduard Fw190 A-5 build. Previously I've covered assembling this kit, and in this video we'll be looking at starting out painting, and we'll be doing the scheme featured on the box art from Eduard Fw190. After the primer had been left to cure for 12 hours, I mixed up 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners, and 3 drops of Vallejo Model Air aluminium, and began to spray it as a base coat over the entire model. To create a subtle pre-shading effect, I first sprayed the middle of each panel, leaving some of the black primer exposed along the panel lines and edges, and then I do a unifying pass over the entire model to blend it all together. I'd been experimenting with aluminium as a base for the paints, and quite liked the results I'd got from it. But I also originally planned to once again attempt using chipping fluid, so on this model I sprayed a thin coat of 6 drops of acrylic thinners mixed with 3 drops of Vallejo chipping fluid over the entire model. In the end, however, I wouldn't end up using the chipping technique, as I wasn't really happy with it on some other results for more subtle weathering. While the chipping fluid dried on the model, I masked off the main canopy using a combination of Tamiya masking tape for the sharp edges, and some liquid mask to fill in the larger areas that are a bit more curved. This was then sprayed off camera with Vallejo Model Air RLM66 to create the interior of its framework colours. To create a strong pre-shading effect, I decided to spray some model colour flat black along all of the panel lines, and then do some very light random patterns with it over the centre of various panels to create some variation in subsequent layers of paint. Though in the future I want to try post-shading the paint later instead of pre-shading, as I found my attempts with pre-shading tend to be a little bit too subtle for my liking. I might also experiment with some lighter colours as well as the black to get a little bit more variation. Once the pre-shading was completed, I moved on to adding the yellow markings. I like to add the yellow markings on Luftwaffe aircraft before painting the camouflage, so that there's no obvious lip or raised edges of the paint that would occur if I applied the yellow over the top of the camouflage. I masked off the areas where I'd be applying yellow to prevent any overspray, which could cause discoloration with the later camouflage colours, and then I sprayed a few passes of Vallejo Model Air RLM4 yellow. Initially I used 1 drop of thinners, 3 drops of Vallejo flow improver, and 3 drops of paint, and did my best to keep the layers thin and transparent. It took a while however, and quite a few passes until the yellow was a solid colour. I also reckon the paint was a bit too thin initially, as I experienced a lot of spiderwebbing, so I later added a few more drops of paint. I find yellow to be a very annoying colour to airbrush. Although I have heard using pink as a base colour can improve how easy it is to apply, I feel my results with several layers was still okay. Once I was satisfied with the yellow, I removed the masking tape from the edges, and then added some over the top of all of the yellow to protect it from the camouflage layers I would be applying next. I started with the lightest colour first, which was for the underside. I mixed up 8 drops of Vallejo acrylic flow improver, 6 drops of AK Interactive acrylic thinners, and 6 drops of AK Interactive RLM76 Variation 1 from the 3rd generation acrylics range. I applied this over the panels first once again, and then make unifying passes, just like as I did with the aluminium base layer. I've always preferred AK Interactive paints for German colours since they all use the RLM codes and seem to be a pretty good match, and I've found that they work just as well with the airbrush as they did when I was brush painting with them. Once I'm happy with the lighter colour and it had had a few hours to fully cure, I then mask off the underside using some Tamiya masking tape, which I like to stick on my arm first just to remove any tackiness before then putting it over the model. I also masked the edges of the horizontal stabilizers and tail to protect the tail area from the first of the camouflage colours. The scheme I chose was the one featured on the box art from Eduard Fw190 on the eastern front. This aircraft is a bit unusual in that it was painted in factory colours of RLM 74 and 75, but then in the field it had 70 and 71 sprayed over the top. On top of this, it also had a temporary white winter wash, which according to the instructions was starting to fade quite heavily. I only found one picture of the actual aircraft, so I had to largely go off of the instructions and box art for reference. I decided to start with the factory colours first, then apply the greens in a rougher fashion, and finally do the winter wash as part of the later on weathering process. So to paint the factory camouflage, I mixed up 6 drops of flow improver, 2 drops of the AK thinners, and 4 drops of the lighter AK Interactive RLM75, mixed it up, and then sprayed it lightly following the camouflage pattern for the other 190 schemes included in the kit. I didn't bother masking any of the upper surface camouflage, as not only do I not really like masking, but the 190s all seem to have a reasonably soft edge to their camouflage, and this layer would also not be very visible with the final greens applied over the top of it. Once applied, acrylic paints dry pretty fast, so I moved on to applying the darker RLM74 in the same fashion, pretty much straight away, and with a similar ratio of thinners to paint. Once I was satisfied with my lighter coat of the factory colours, I then mixed up 8 drops of Flow Improver, 6 drops of the AK acrylic thinners, and 5 drops of AK RLM71, the lighter of the 2 green colours. After some test spraying, I ended up adding 4 more drops of paint to make it a little bit thicker, and once I'd mixed it up, I began to apply it onto the model following the marking guide. I tried to keep the paint nice and thin so that the darker greys would show through, and in some areas I also added a few more layers in patchy spots to give it a very rough field paint job kind of look. I also left some of the grey exposed near the wing roundel and wingtips based on the instructions. Once I was happy with the light green, I moved on to the darker green, which would be RLM70. For this paint, I decided to mix up 10 drops of acrylic flow improver with 5 drops of the RLM70, and skip adding the thinners to see if the thicker mix would help me achieve some sharper edges for the camouflage pattern. Following the marking guide, I sprayed it in the same manner as with the 71, leaving softer areas and adding a few larger models on the tail. I found that the flow improver already thinned the paint quite adequately, and it stopped me from having tip drying as much with the airbrush. After I'd applied the RLM70, I was really happy with how everything looked, so I ended up removing all of the masking tape and spraying the entire model with a few light coats of Vallejo acrylic gloss varnish. This would seal the paint job from getting scratched or otherwise damaged, and also provide a smooth glossy surface to apply decals to, which helps to prevent them from silvering. I gave the varnish 12 hours to fully cure, and then I began to cut out the decals I wanted from the marking sheet. I noticed the Eduard marking guide didn't show any of the common stencils on the aircraft. Looking at references of other 190s that had been done up in non-standard paint schemes in the field, most of them still seem to have a lot of their common markings, especially the fuel placards. I guess this would be at the unit's discretion, but I decided to apply only some of the markings, including the fuel ones, and keep any stencils that would have been applied on the RLM76 areas, since these would not have been overpainted. To apply the decals, I stick them in some warm distilled water, and once the decals start to lift off the paper, I slide them onto the model using my brush or a finger. There's a fair bit of clear film on the number 5 decal, but otherwise it wasn't too bad, and fortunately all of the decals went on with no issues. Once all the decals are in place, I apply my usual combo of Vallejo decal softener, using a cotton bud to gently rub it onto all of the decals, and follow this up with some Tamiya decal adhesive. This will help to soften the decals so that they show the surface details of the model, and the adhesive will then help them to stick to any complex shapes and surfaces, which I found very effective on this kit, which has a lot of rivet and recess details. I then left the decals to settle for around about 12 hours, and then I applied a few light coats of Vallejo's acrylic matte varnish over the entire model. This would protect the decals from the upcoming winter wash and weathering process, and it would also help blend them together with the camouflage colours, making them all look like they were painted on. So that wraps up painting the camouflage layers for this aircraft. In the next video, which will hopefully be coming out next week, I'll cover adding the winter wash camouflage, doing some weathering, and adding on all of those smaller parts we've left off the build so far. So if you enjoyed this part, then please be sure to leave a like. And if you have any friendly advice or any questions, please be sure to leave it down in the comment section below. A big shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to fund not only buying these kits, but also the products I use to make them. If you want to help fund my videos, then please be sure to check out my Patreon, a link to which I'll leave in the description. Later this week, I should be releasing another Corsair inbox review, and as mentioned, next week I should have part 3 of this build done, and I'll be following it up with a full version in the future. That's it for now though, but until the next video, take care, and as always, model on.